This is Classical Ideas with Greg Soden. Welcome to Classical Ideas. A prolific author and speaker, Eleanor Watts was one of the first to interpret Eastern wisdom for a Western audience. Born outside London in 1915, he discovered the nearby Buddhist lodge at a young age. After moving to the United States in 1938, Allen became an Episcopal priest for a time and then relocated to Millbrook, New York, where he wrote his pivotal book, The Wisdom of Insecurity, a message for an age of anxiety. In 1951, he moved to San Francisco, where he began teaching Buddhist studies, and in 1956 began his popular radio show, Way Beyond the West. By the early 60s, Allen's radio talks aired nationally, and the counterculture movement adopted him as a spiritual spokesman. He wrote and traveled regularly until his passing in 1973. You can find information on his work at www.alanwatts.org. My guest today is Allen's daughter, Ann Watts, one of the co-editors of the new book, The Collected Letters of Eleanor Watts, released in January 2018 from New World Library. Ann Watts is a profoundly loving facilitator and educator who is committed to creating a world where everyone wins. She honors each individual for the gift she or he is, and believes that love and nurturance are the most important aspects in human healing. In her workshops and private sessions, Ann creates a safe, non-judgmental environment where clients experience being seen, heard, and validated. She has the ability to read between the lines and hone in on the heart of the matter in a way that supports clients in healing their relationship with past and current issues as they grow into the person they have always dreamed of being. She regularly leads workshops at the Esalen Institute, and you can find her upcoming events online at www.annwatts.org. Today, Ann and I are discussing the life of Eleanor Watts, part 2 in my series with Joan and Ann Watts. Together, they edited the new book, The Collected Letters of Eleanor Watts. Without further delay, I bring you Ann Watts. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. I am here today with Ann Watts, one of the editors of the new Collected Letters of Eleanor Watts. Ann, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
I'm delighted to be invited. Thank you.
So I want to start off by talking to you about a quote that you wrote in the book. So this collection is an extraordinary depiction of Alan's private thoughts and life. And deep in the book, you write, quote, "He always had tender feelings for all his children. He just had no idea how to be a fully responsible father. He did know how to work, and his work was extraordinary." I loved that quote. And as soon as I saw it, I circled it and wrote Ann next to in the book. So I see in your notes that Alan definitely wore different masks in public and in private, and he was kind of a different as a parent and as a public figure. Millions of people have known Alan via his face that he projected to the world as a scholar, but what was he like in his private life with the kids?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that Joan's and my experience may be different in some respects to the other 5 children. So I can't speak for all of us. I can speak for myself for sure.
Absolutely.
And so my experience of him was that he was often an absentee father. He just wasn't available. And so he wasn't available because he was working and he was gone a lot. And or he was writing, and he'd be completely engrossed in his writing. And I also felt like in many ways he wasn't available to be emotionally supportive. And so, because he would want to stay out of any conflict. So I didn't feel like he had my back, so to speak. But on the other hand, as you know, as a father, I called him Daddy, and he was playful and creative, and he loved to do things like draw with us, or sing songs with us, or dance, and just I mean, he was really very very playful and sweet to hang out with when he was around. So, I felt like that was, I felt good about that. I just wish that there were more times that he was available.
Yeah. So your letters collection that you and Joan, your sister, just released on New World Library, you have about 400 letters in the book, right? Does that sound about right?
Probably.
And so I'm curious if is this like the collection to end all collections for Alan Watts's letters, or is there more out there that you may be digging into in the future?
I doubt it. I really think that we culled the most significant letters, and the ones that really were meaningful to his life and what he was up to. And so I don't expect that there's going to be a follow-up book. I think this is pretty much the definitive book from in terms of the collected letters, and in terms of Joan's and my perspective of that journey. Yeah.
Do you predict any other large scale Alan projects? The other day, Joan mentioned to me that Alan was like a talented painter. Are there any other like collected artworks or like photography collections that we might expect someday? Do you see yourself doing another large scale project like that?
I think if we were to do something along those lines, it would be a much smaller scale. I mean, I think this is like a tome. This book, it's a big work, and the wonderful thing for me is that it was really engaging to read. There are moments when the letters get really heady, but mostly I found, and I've always struggled to read Alan's books because they're just more heady than I'm really willing to slog through.
They are challenging, yes.
Yeah, and so, but this book, I'm starting to read it again, and it's just as interesting now as it was when we first went through the letters, mm-hmm. and so. Yeah, I think it's an amazing collection. I think he was such a prolific writer. He loved writing, and it's cute because he often apologizes for the length of his letters.
He does.
So, he's like, "I'm sorry to go on so much," but he really was so engaged in mm-hmm. whatever he was writing about. So that was fun. I appreciated that. Yeah.
I'm reading Still the Mind, Introduction to Meditation by Alan. I'm reading What is Tao, What is Zen, his little series. And I completely agree. Reading his letters is completely different than reading his academic and scholarly works. So I think that if there's anybody out there looking for an accessible voice of getting into Alan Watts' work, that this would almost be a fantastic place to start before you get into his deep philosophical work. So I completely agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, yeah.
So one of my favorite things about the book is the large collection of well-known folks that are in the book, including like Gary Snyder, Aldous Huxley, Joseph Campbell. I mean, it was just a delight to sift through these. And I read on the back cover of the book in which Gary Snyder, the famous Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, wrote, "It took some years after his death before I could see and appreciate the whole." So your relationship with Alan throughout the book is undeniably complex, and your relationship with him, it varies, as you mentioned in your first statement. So do you agree with Snyder? Did it take some years for you to appreciate the whole? Like, how has he evolved in your mind from when you were a kid until now?
Well, I found that as I became an adult, we really formed a friendship, and that was quite delightful. And I knew him as a family man of my dad, and as a social person, and I was often present when he was giving lectures ever since I was a little kid. And I was around a lot of his students and the celebrities in his life. We used to go and visit Aldous Huxley and his family down in Ojai, and those that was just part of my growing up experience. And but I have to say that reading the letters gave me a much deeper perspective of his experience throughout his life. And one of the things that I think I said in the book was that I was stunned by his brilliance at such a young age. I'm reading these letters and I'm thinking, how old were you when you wrote this?
Yeah.
And so one of the things where that shows up too is a letter he wrote to Carl Jung when he was still quite young, and he writes to Jung like an equal.
Mm-hmm.
Like everyone he wrote to, whether it was Christmas Humphreys or Carl Jung or anyone else, it was very much, here's my mind meeting your mind. And so I'm really curious about what you have to say about this, and here's some information that might be useful to you, and that kind of thing that was just like really amazing to see.
I love the fact that throughout the story, he really grows into his relationship with you, it seems, as you get older. Like, he was so complimentary of a lot of things in your lifestyle whenever you became an adult, that I can
Right.
see that he really thought that you were amazing as you got older. Like, as you mentioned, the friendship developed. So I loved seeing that.
Right. Well, actually, it was pretty astonishing to me. I did not know he thought about me the way he did. When I'm reading these letters, and I'm seeing him describing me to other people, and I'm like, wow, because he never, like, we just were together, and he
Mm-hmm.
didn't say to me, I'm loving this about you or that about you or any of that, the kind of thing that I might say to my kids.
Mm-hmm.
Kids, it's like we just were together, and so it was quite an eye opener. Yeah, so it's been such an interesting journey, because Joan says this also, that she was the favorite child.
Mm-hmm.
And my story was always that she was a wanted child. She was born when my parents were very much in love with each other, and so that was like so wonderful and exciting. And by the time I came along, things had started to fall apart in my parents' marriage, and my mother really wanted a boy, and I wasn't a boy. And I felt like she took her misery out on me,
Mm-hmm.
and so, which Daddy describes in the book, and then his second wife, there was a similar kind of experience, and so it was tough until the time when my grandparents came and saw what was going on, and took me to live in England with them, and I went to girls' boarding school, and I knew at the time they had saved my life. It was
Mm-hmm.
really amazing, and so good for me.
Yeah. So this childhood that you're describing right now, it's not a rosy picture the whole time. Even though your dad is like a famous philosopher, so there's complexity there. And Joan describes you in the book as always feeling like you you weren't able to do anything right, that you were always feeling like you were naughty, that you were doing things wrong, which is something that a lot of kids feel like. If your parents always say, don't do this, don't do that, it's just a kind of a result. So as a mom yourself, you just mentioned your own kids. Mm-hmm. So as a mom yourself, when you think back about these early memories of feeling that way, how did they influence your own parenting? Like, what did you do as a parent to kind of counteract what you had experienced?
That's very complex for me. So I have to say, first of all, I just want to admit I was naughty. I was curious, and I was always into things, and so I remember one time we were at my grandmother's house, and she had servants, and the table was laid for one of her many elegant, fancy dinners, and applesauce had been put out for people to clear their palate, right? Mm-hmm. And I was going around putting my finger in and tasting each one. I loved applesauce. And so Lawrence came in and caught me red-handed, and I looked at him, and this is just a often told story. Just tasting, Lawrence, just tasting. But there were always things, and then there would be things that would get blamed for that I didn't do, kind of thing. So fast forward to when I'm having my own children. I was 20 years old when I gave birth to my first child, and really not well prepared to be a parent. I didn't really, I knew I was good with children on the whole. I had done a lot of babysitting over the years, and I love kids, and I loved my children. And I think the thing that I did best as a parent was to let them know how much I loved them. Mm-hmm. And so they always knew that. That was like the major thing. And but it was somewhat of a struggle for me to be the kind of mom that I wish I could have been, right? Mm-hmm. And I know I made lots of mistakes as a mother, and nowadays I can say to people some things that could be done differently than I did them as a parent. But I felt like I came into parenthood kind of blind, like not really having had a good model for that.
The reason why I wanted to ask you that question in particular is also kind of selfish on my part. I have a 4-year-old, and she's a lovely, lovely, curious little girl, and she's very busy. And so I wanted to ask your question on on your experience of, what should I do? So I'm really glad that I asked. Thank you.
Right. Well, let me just tell you one thing that I frequently tell parents now, and that is, there's this thing when we're busy and we're doing things, and the child wants our attention, and our tendency is to say, "I'm busy, not now." Mm-hmm. And I'm a strong proponent of people putting a bookmark in what they're doing, even if they're cooking. Take it off the burner, and crouch down and give your child your full attention for now. And my experience of kids is that's all it takes. It doesn't take a long time. You give them the attention right now, and they're off to the next thing. They're satisfied with that, and so that's kind of the thing that I often tell parents now, stop and really pay attention. In my counseling experience, I often hear people say, my children are the most important thing in my life, or my spouse and my children. But they're not living their lives like that's true. Mm-hmm. And so I think, just stopping and paying attention says, you're important. You matter to me. Mm-hmm.
Well, after we're done talking today, I'm picking up my 4-year-old from her preschool, so I will take these words away with me today, I promise.
Great.
So, Alan's letters in the book are beautiful interactions between him and his parents, and that was the thread that I pulled through the entire book, is always really gravitating towards... I gravitated more towards his letters to his parents than between famous people like Aldous Huxley and Joseph Campbell and Gary Snyder. Mm-hmm. So, Joan mentioned that some letters from his parents were among the letters you sorted through. What were the other sides of these conversations like? Because we read Alan's voice, but we don't hear Lawrence.
Right. Well, here's the thing. One of the reasons we didn't include those letters is that they are really hard to read. His handwriting was very difficult to read. So I can't really answer that question.
Mm.
I know that, when my grandparents were not happy about the divorce with Eleanor, and they were not happy about the divorce with Dorothy, and they let Alan know that in no uncertain terms that did not sit well with them. Even though he tried to kind of sugarcoat it and be as nice as he could, I think they wrote very kind letters to both my mother and my stepmother Dorothy, and my grandfather was very, very fond of Jano, Alan's third and last wife. They got along like a house of fire. So, So while they weren't happy with the fact that there were these divorces, they and by that time my grandfather was pretty not so much with my mother, but with Dorothy. I think he really knew that my father was seeing other women and that kind of thing, and he wasn't happy with that. But they were just so close. They were like best friends. All of my father's life, he and his dad in particular were best friends.
Imagine if they had Skype when they were alive.
Right? Right. It would have been a regular thing. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's so painful that you and I are able to do this just like that, and thinking about how much that would have benefited those two guys to be able to do that with each other. It just makes me sad kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, but you know what, Gary? We wouldn't have those letters.
True.
And that's the thing that's a real treasure, is that we have those letters where he describes what was going on and all of that. And so if he'd been Skyping, we wouldn't have that record.
Yeah.
And that's going to be something, like if for the future, all of that kind of thing isn't going to be present anymore. We're not going to have those kinds of archives. And I feel the missing of that. I feel, and one of the things, Alan was so good with language, and I feel like language is deteriorating because of our social media. Everything's shorthand and pictures and and so it's interesting to see what that might morph into. I don't know.
I'm interested indeed. I'm a high school teacher, so I see these types of things every day. Every conversation, every comment you just made, I look at every single day in my job. So it's important. I'm really glad everything that you just said about the letters being there and available. It matters. It does matter.
Yeah.
So in the book, I noticed that you did include a letter from your mother, Eleanor Watts.
Right.
And so her relationship with Alan, we can watch it kind of go downhill in the letters, and you referred to that a lot just now. But it seems like she also wasn't really loving her time. First of all, I really gravitated towards the letters in Alan's priesthood years. I thought that was really interesting. But it seems that Eleanor was not really loving her time as a priest's wife, because she refers to herself as a Taoistic Vedantist in Christian garb, which I loved, as if she was knowing that she was like wearing a costume or playing dress up. Did you ever discover anything else about these conflicted views in her life?
I wasn't so present to it. She, I think she really she had both things going on, but her adoption of Christianity was different from my father's. And so she became very almost like a Catholic in her way of acceptance of Christianity. I think she desperately needed it to help her through what she was going through with Alan. But when she married Carlton, they became Quakers. They became Quakers. Yeah, and that was where she was. But she always had the strong Zen influence in her life. I mean, that was part of her life ever since she was a girl, and particularly in her teenage years. But I would like to just read, because you mentioned that to me earlier, and I went back to this letter to Henry Miller. And can I read a paragraph?
Of course.
Yeah. So she says, I was so delighted to get your letter and hear firsthand of your interest in Zen. Yes, in a way, Zen is it for me, too. My husband calls me a Taoist, Vedantist in Christian garb. So that was my dad's name for her. A bit of a mix-up, but I suppose he's right. Strangely enough, I never understood the Eastern doctrines until I became a Christian. But without them, I would never have become one, as it is, rather a robbing Peter to pay Paul affair at best. My mother, whom you probably know through her husband Shigetsu Sasaki, remains a scholastic Buddhist, but is producing some very valuable material through the First Zen Institute. It's interesting that she says scholastic Buddhist followed by but. Right? She is working on another book, which she hopes to publish in the fall. I do feel that Sokian Sasaki, his religious name, his work is the most lucid we have had in English, and it is wonderful that she is able to give it to the public. So in a way, she's introducing Henry Miller to the work of my grandmother as well. What's really fun for me is that is in the collected letters. And then just recently, a woman by the name of Janica Anderson, who's been doing extensive research on my grandmother, Ruth Sasaki, wrote a book. And it's called Zen Odyssey, the story of Sokian, Ruth Fuller Sasaki, and the birth of Zen in America. And what is so fun for me is that this book so dovetails with the collected letters. There are many references to the same people and the same experiences, but from different perspectives. Like this book is about Ruth and her perspective. And so it's really fun to have both of those together. And I'm amazed that they both came out simultaneously almost.
Well, and you got to spend some time in Japan, right, with Ruth Sasaki?
I did.
So can you tell us a little bit about living with a Rinzai Zen grandmother in Japan?
Yeah, well, my sister lived there for a whole year. And while she was there was a man who did an article in Time magazine about our grandmother. And he looked at my sister and said, I know just the man for you to meet. And he's the one who introduced her to her first husband. And he was a Lieutenant JG in the Navy. Anyway, they got engaged and then got married there in Japan. And I was flown out from girls' boarding school in England, and I came via the U.S., joined my mother, and we came to Japan for the wedding. And so, my grandmother's home, the place where she lived, was completely Japanese style. So it was all the tatami floors. everything was floor, like the tables were down on the floor at level, and the beds were put away in cupboards during the day and rolled out at night. All of that whole thing. And however, my grandmother did have a staff who ran the house. So people who cooked the meals and who, and she had taught, so she ate both Japanese style and Western style things that she taught them how to cook.
Oh, nice.
And, yeah. And so she had this lovely area, the living area, and then she built a zendo, which was the place where people came and did their meditation. It's a beautiful building, and she built a library, and in that library is where she did her research and translations, and she had a whole team, including Gary Snyder, working for her there, and the book Zen Odyssey puts all that out there and has photographs of all of that. Anyway, I loved it. I love, because it's been a part of my life always, both with my grandmother and my father, there's always been this flavor of Japanese that I love. And particularly the more old-time Japanese. For instance, I love the old architecture, the wooden buildings. They're just so beautiful. And the sliding walls and all of that. And I'm not so fond of the big concrete buildings that they have so much of now. But their aesthetic, the gardens and the way they do their bonsai and the food and the way they serve their food, everything's a work of art. And that was a thrill for me as a teenager. I was lucky as an adult. I was able to come back and do some workshops in Japan. And while I was there, the producer of our workshops took me to back to my grandmother's temple down at Daitokuji in Kyoto. And so I got to see it again and meet the Roshi who was currently there and kind of, take that trip down memory lane, because very little had changed. It's aged and it's worn, but it's basically the same as it was.
I'm really looking forward to reading Zen Odyssey now. I can't wait.
Yeah.
I'm going to get it as soon as I possibly can.
Yeah.
I love the playful competition that Alan seems to have between he and Ruth Sasaki in the book. It seems like both of them are he has this immense respect for her and she's kind of eyeing him warily from over here, but it seems like they have this mutual respect going on, even though their paths had separated when Eleanor and Alan had gotten divorced.
Well, I would say she was kind of in awe of how he was able to be so popular and so read. But I mean, she scoffed at the fact that he wasn't a serious student, and he wasn't a meditator. He not that he didn't ever meditate. He did. And I think I recall Gary saying that the two of them meditated together. And my father went to some very deep places. But, I think part of it is he didn't he didn't want to be so serious about everything. And my grandmother was very serious. She was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Everything was by the book, completely by the book for her. And I think part of that was really important to her because she really wanted to be accepted in Japan. She wanted that. And she was able to prove to them that she could do what was required. Even though she was a woman and even though she was a Westerner, she could do what was required to be accepted into their brotherhood. And so she was very much strictly by the book. The interesting thing is that very few people know about Ruth Sasaki,
Mm-hmm.
whereas people all over the world have heard of Alan Watts and
Yeah.
read his books. And she did some important work, but only the deepest scholars access that work.
Yeah.
And so it's so interesting that in her seriousness and in that scholarly approach that she had, and not that Alan wasn't a scholar, he was an amazing scholar, and voracious about information and learning things in lots of different areas. And I think that was another part of it for him. He was interested in more than one road. He was interested in so many areas, including science and art and music and all of that. He just had a voracious appetite.
Yeah, there was one video I watched of him on YouTube recently where he's standing in a field in a wonderful sweater with long hair, and he's talking about how his worldview was a mixture of Buddhist and Hinduism. So I could tell that he was not on one path. He seemed to be on multiple paths at once, which is something that I identify with within myself as well. There's so many interesting things to learn about so many things that I would consider myself more of an Alan Watts than a Ruth Sasaki if I had to see what practice is like. Because Rinzai temples, I mean, it's a very strict Zazen practice, and it's very difficult. So I love that distinction that Ruth seems to say that Alan's not doing Zazen. You know what I mean?
Right. And he attempted it with the man who became her husband, Sokian Sasaki, and so he thought he had found his teacher in Sokian, but I think Alan didn't have the patience or the ability to really surrender to a master. And Sokian was every bit as severe and by the book, and it's got to be like this, and you've got to reach this level or you're not going anywhere. It's not real. And so apparently he was just an extraordinary man, Sokian, and my dad had great love and respect for him as well. But he wasn't going to be that student that went to that detail.
Yeah. And if he had, then we wouldn't have so many works from him, most likely.
Right.
So not only has he written so many books, but he is all over the internet to this day. He is all over YouTube. Do you ever visit with him on YouTube in his lectures collections?
Occasionally people send me a link to something, and I'll listen to that, and some of them I think are really delightful. What is the cartoon group that I can't remember their name. The very famous cartoons that they had a TV. That maybe they do The Simpsons. Is that it?
Oh yeah.
Who've done a bunch of caricatures of Alan and speaking his words, and they're great. I love them. They're really fun, and I think Alan would love them.
Yeah.
And so I've enjoyed that. But my life is so full and so busy. I do not have time to be searching around and going down a memory lane in that way. I just have so much on my plate, so that's kind of I don't do a lot of that. No.
Do you have any artifacts from Alan's life? In the book, he talks about tons of temple gongs and kimonos. Do you have any artifacts of Alan's that you treasure?
You know what? I did have some of those things, and I passed them on to my children now.
Nice.
Like I've passed a lot of my belongings, stuff that belonged to my grandmother and stuff that belonged to my mother and stuff that belonged to my father. I've passed it on down so they could have it and enjoy it now and rather than later. So I have, not sure that I actually have anything other than photographs.
And all things are impermanent, right?
Right. I do have a few pieces of his artwork and his calligraphy. I do have some of that. Yeah.
Cool. So one of the things that I really loved about your essays in the book, as opposed to Jones, is that you really latched on to like Alan's political letters, and you seem to love his political letters that he wrote, which start
Right.
to spring up in his last decade of life.
Right.
So what do you think would be some of Alan's thoughts on our unusual era that we find ourselves in today?
Well, I mean, he wrote about police brutality back then,
Mm-hmm.
and he wanted the government to stay out of Native American religions and practices and stuff like that. He wanted them to stay out of it, leave them alone, allow them the grace of their own culture, and he was vociferous about, policemen should be doing the work about keeping us safe and staying out of our bedrooms, and and then he was a strong proponent of drugs like marijuana and LSD should also be monitored more by doctors, but not by the law, and that that making it illegal would make it criminal, and rightly, and so yeah, that's exactly what happened. And so here we are in an era where the people are saying, let's let marijuana be legal now because we can see that it has many helpful purposes, and it's not this big, horrible, dangerous thing. And but there are people who still have their prejudice about it, and they want to make it illegal. But it wasn't working when it was illegal.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't stop people. It's the same thing as prohibition back in the years, when they banned alcohol. And so what people got was stronger alcohol than ever, that was made in somebody's backyard, and so you're not going to suppress that kind of thing. And I think Alan would be absolutely up in arms. And I guess what's so interesting to me is things haven't really changed all that much. Like much of what he was writing about back then it's what we're dealing with right now. It's the same.
He seems like he's really ahead of his time politically, like speaking out wise.
Right. And but I feel like all of his work is timeless in some way.
I agree.
It's like Bach or Beethoven or the great composers. Their music is timeless. It's always something that people will appreciate in so many ways, and I think Alan's work is the same. I'm blown away. I've just recently, a 15-year-old from I think it was Sweden or Denmark wrote me and talked to me about how Alan's work was affecting him and how he was touched. And he started asking me questions about my childhood and that kind of thing. And so I told him about the book,
Yeah.
All the answers to the questions you're asking me are in the book.
Lovely.
But 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I often have had teenagers speak to me like that and say that, or I'll meet adults who say that when they were teenagers, they found Alan and what a difference it had made for them finding him. So,
Yeah. I could totally picture a 103-year-old Alan Watts with a pipe hanging out of his mouth at Standing Rock or protesting like oil spills. I could see I could see that happening. Like, so whenever I hear about current events in today's news, like indigenous rights protests or pipeline ruptures, I could picture Alan Watts being involved in that kind of stuff now that I've read this letters collection.
Well, I think he would be involved, but I think he would be much more likely to be writing letters, making phone calls, than he would to be actually be there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually what he did. And I think partly because he felt like he was really good at expressing himself through his writing. And that was his best venue for that. Not to say that maybe he would have been, if people had invited him, he might have been there, certainly to speak out. Definitely, he was an ally in so many ways. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite section in the book? Like, they're broken up by eras in his life. Do you have a particular section that you feel like you'll go to for many years to come?
Well, I have to say that the first section, which involves the letters from his childhood, when he was young, when he was away at boarding school, that he wrote to his parents, and his early letters when he moved to New York with my mother. A lot of that, the descriptions of America were so amazing, and he was so taken with his experience. And he writes often like a painter. He told me once that he thought he was going to be an artist. It never occurred to him he was going to be a writer. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's kind of like really the most fun in some ways for me to read that. And some of the other sort of the middle years are more difficult because of my own difficult childhood. And then the letters towards the end, as you say, when he's really quite politically motivated. Some of those letters are very, very interesting to me. Yeah.
You seem to like the commentary on the love letters from you in particular was very funny. I was laughing when I was reading your essays about his love letters. Were those fun for you to find in the stacks?
I don't know about fun. I mean, it's a little bit, a window into your parents' sex life and their, that romantic oohing and eyeing kind of thing that he did quite a lot with Jano.
Oh boy.
It was a bit much. I mean, Joan and I tried to tone it down some because it was so it was so extreme, and it was interesting to me that the level of goo goo gaga attachment kind of thing that he had with her was not like anything else I saw anywhere, and I mean, he certainly he had a very loving relationship with that poet Jean Burden, and who Joan and I had never heard of until we got involved in this book.
Oh wow!
We had never even heard of her. So that was a very well kept secret certainly from us. And so it was a fascinating experience. I think she's an amazing poet. I've read some of her work.
The poem that you mentioned that she wrote about Alan, I went and found that online in an old literary journal, and I read it, and I was really blown away. So I was totally turned on to a new poet's work that I've never even heard of either. So you brought Jean Burden to me as well. Yeah. So, and I could see that there was this deep mutual respect.
And there were some very deep levels at which they connected that was unique to them.
Mm-hmm.
And but I could also, she was quoted as saying, women were like catnip to Alan, and I really thought that was so right on, and that was difficult for her. That was more than she was up for in terms of her own emotional harmony, I think.
Sure.
So, yeah.
So Joan and I spent quite a long time on Alan's later years and how things seemed to get away from him as far as his smoking and his vices that ultimately led to a premature death in his life. Do you have any favorite memories or things that you wanted to comment on as far as Alan's later years go whenever you were grown up? How did you find your relationship with him as he neared the end of his life?
Well, I moved with my family to Raleigh, North Carolina, because my husband at the time, Joel Andrews, was asked to be musician in residence in Raleigh, North Carolina, and so I didn't have that same level of being around him. And so really the thing that I am so grateful for is that in 1973, on Easter vacation, Alan was in Pennsylvania. I described this in the book. Mira and I drove up there Mira being my daughter, she and I drove up there to see him. And we had a lovely time being with him. And I am so grateful that we did that we did what it took to drive all that distance and be there, because it was that November that he died. And so that will always be a truly precious memory for me. And I just want to say, too, that another interesting thing is after he died, and I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the TV was on, and all of a sudden, I heard my father's voice. And I have to tell you, that was so weird and eerie, like here is this man who's gone. He's not here anymore, but I'm hearing his voice. And it's just kind of a sort of mind-twisting experience. I've gotten very used to it now, but certainly right so soon after his death, it was really just the most bizarre thing.
And I know that you attended his funeral at Green Gulch Farm, part of the San Francisco Zen Center, and that it was presided over by Richard Baker Roshi, the Dharma heir of Shunryu Suzuki. What stands out for the funeral that you remember?
Well, of course, I loved the ceremony and again, I'm back in Japan there,
right.
And their Zendo and the incense and the beauty of the altar and my dad's photograph on the altar and the beautiful garments that the Roshi and the people who were supporting him were wearing. And then the gathering of people, and the gentleness of everyone that was there, how, there'd be these little groups of people talking all around. And Al Huang, who finished his last book, Tao, the Watercourse Way, had his bamboo flute, and he played his flute there. And, all of those things. It was really, really, Green Gulch is in a beautiful area, and it was, it felt exactly perfect for Alan. And and half of his ashes were buried there. We all walked up the hill and went to the site where his ashes were buried there, and then the other half are up at Druid Heights, where he had been living. So Joan and I actually recently visited there and got to see the stupa and the whole, the library, which is now returning itself to nature. And
so is Druid Heights? Is it kind of is it protected? Is anybody maintaining, or is it kind of deteriorating? I know that it's been kind of
Right.
debated.
Well, there's one couple that still lives there that were there at the time that my dad was there. And one of the houses there has been continuously rented out. The state owns that property. It went back to the state as the various members of that community have died. The state has then, they now, it's part of parkland there. And the state has done nothing to preserve the buildings. There is a group of people who would like to get permission from the state to preserve the buildings and have it as a retreat center for artists and writers and that kind of thing, which is something that I absolutely have respect for, and it would be a lovely thing. However, at the same time, Roger Summers, the man who built all the buildings there, he built them with the intent that they would go back to nature.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so I think the people who are living up there are really in support of that themselves. And the building that was partially Roger's working studio and also living quarters on the other end, it reminds me of the Planet of the Apes, like the trees and the vines and the plants are growing inside the house and taking over, and it's really an amazing sight. So the other houses, not so much, they're perfectly, you could resuscitate them, so to speak. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't know that the park has any interest in doing anything other than letting the whole thing go back to nature. We'll see.
So, Anne, I'm becoming mindful of your time, and we're coming to the end of our hour here together. And I've loved our conversation so much, and I want you to go on a little theoretical journey here with me for a second. So, I teach high school in Missouri, in the middle of the country, and I have 145 students this semester. So if you were to walk into my classroom in front of a group of American teenagers, what do you think would be the most important things for them to know about the life and work of Alan Watts?
Whew.
Because he has this amazing cross-generational influence,
Mm-hmm.
and he really could, I think, be a meaningful voice to young people today. So what do you think would resonate with Alan with young people today, if you were to explain it to them?
Right. I don't know how well equipped I am to answer that, given that I haven't been a student of his work. And it would be interesting to me, I have never asked those people who told me that they got turned on to Alan in their teen years, what it was that really struck them, right? I know one of the books he recommended to me when I was in my 20s, that he was one of his favorite books. The two books he recommended to me, one was The Wisdom of Insecurity, and the other was Nature, Man, and Woman. And I would suspect that both of those books would be really valuable to our current crop of teens. And then the other thing I would say is to find him on YouTube, because he's such an engaging speaker that I think that that a lot of people would be really delighted by what he had to say, and then go from there. I mean, some of the things that he would say, for instance, would be, do what you love, right? He talks about this whole business of people feeling like they have to be goal-oriented and get somewhere, and, like, and you get to this place, and now you have to get to the next place, and then you have to get to the next place, and there's always this kind of struggle to, you're on this almost like this treadmill that just keeps going and going and going, and you're not having any fun.
Yeah.
And so, he really strongly wanted people to do the things that they really love, and that would enrich their lives.
It's so amazing to me that you just brought up that, because I actually watched a video segment of him talking about that 2 days ago, that exact segment, and it really stands out to me because we tend to go from thing to thing to thing, and we don't live for now. We live for some time where we are in the future that we're not at yet. So I think being in our lives, being in our bodies, realizing the moments that are looking us in the face right now, that really resonates with me right now as well.
The other thing about my father was he was a really good listener. And my experience of the youth today is how intelligent they are, how smart they are. And I think being good listeners to them, to find out what they're thinking about and what matters to them, is something that we could all benefit from. And it's, like for me, in terms of the whole sexual revolution and people honoring people of different sexual orientation, whether you call yourself heterosexual, or you call yourself gay, or you call yourself transsexual, or you call yourself asexual, or, you live in a non-binary world or whatever, right? The kids are on it. Mm-hmm. They're really on it. And they're not, and so many teenagers are saying, I am not choosing to be either male or female. I am choosing to be gender fluid. That's what I choose. And so they all understand that language really well. And they no longer use the pronouns of he and she, but other pronouns, er and a and am, and there's a whole category. You can look them up online, but they're in it, and we adults are. I, for one, I'm in the field of teaching about human sexuality, and I don't. I struggle with learning the new language myself, but the teenagers, they don't struggle with it at all. It's just like, what is? And so, I just feel like they have a lot to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we can listen.
Yeah.
And this has been a wonderful conversation. It has been so much of a pleasure for me to read this work and then talk to you and Joan. It's been, if I could open up this book and show you right now, like, my scribblings are everywhere. Like, I have just immersed myself in this work that you and Joan so painstakingly put together over the course of 2 years. So I would encourage everybody who hears this to go and get The Collected Letters of Alan Watts by Joan and Ann Watts, put out by New World Library, and check it out and dive into this life. And what's so amazing to me about the conversation that you just had with me and that I had with Joan is that it doesn't give away any of the magnificence of the book.
Right.
We just talked about your stories about his life, but the letters are totally separate from these conversations. So these conversations are definitely not a substitute for reading the real book.
Right. Great. You're so right. Thank you. Yeah.
So, Anne, if anybody wanted to find more of your work, where should they look?
I have a website, www.annewatts.com. So if people go there, it's the website is a work of art in progress because there's so much new going on for us to add to it. But yeah, that's where people can find out about the work that I do. both with the Human Awareness Institute and at Esalen Institute. So that's the love of my life, is doing the work with the Human Awareness Institute. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anne.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is performed and composed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you would like to support this show, please subscribe or leaving a rating in iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.